Never fight the last war. Quote from Robert Greene. The Greek thinker Aristotle thought that life was defined by movement. What does not move is dead. What has speed and mobility has more possibilities, more life. Monsters of myth, art, and our imagination depart from a shared understanding of what it means to be human. They are seen as unnatural and amoral. Monsters are portrayed as grotesque, prone to mutation, shifting shape, unpredictable, and out of control. These attributes and others provide monsters with otherworldly power and a disturbing capacity for extreme violence and destruction. Monsters are terrifying forces. This description of monsters, that is the manifestation and embodiment of our deepest, darkest fears, can also be applied to global terror networks, their leaders, and bloodied hand operatives. Global terror networks also depart from commonly shared values and understandings, and like monsters, terror groups have an awesome ability to perpetrate horrific violence, partly due to the shapes and forms they take. The global terror organisation's ability to rapidly change shape and behaviour, to mutate according to the space and time they inhabit, is partly due to the slow decline of the nation state and the steady rise of the global network. Global networks are speedy, mobile, decentralised, without territory, and flow not only through and around a nation-state's physical boundaries with ease, but also a nation-state's ideological and information boundaries as well. This scenario has made global terror groups not only difficult to locate, pin down and destroy, but terrifying forces, monsters. A relaxed Brad Kilburn was mulling over global terror network dynamics as he stood in short grass and the dark, 40 metres from an aircraft runway located outside the northern Thai city of Chiang Rai. As he looked out over the tarmac toward the silhouetted palm tree lined fence line a couple of 100 metres away, Kilburn was thinking about terror group dynamics because he was on the cusp of shutting down the branch of one. However, as he stood there in the humid night amongst Royal Thai Army Special Forces, all tooled up and ready to go, Kilburn had his doubts about this cross-border operation to cut off the head of this new network. As the operators around him chatted and joked in hushed tones, he had an uneasy feeling in his gut. Maybe this was just the start of something, not the end, he thought. The start of something not experienced before in irregular warfare circles. Though these doubts disappeared in a flash when two Thai military tandem rotor CH-47 Chinook helicopters came into earshot as they flew in from the south. The tall, athletically built Kilburn adjusted the ballistic vest he was wearing over the top of his tiger-stripe camouflage long-sleeve shirt with paratrooper front pockets. The brand new vest was stiff and didn't fit right yet, and the black backpack he had on his back wasn't helping matters. So he readjusted the straps on the pack as well. Sweat poured from his pores, his back soaked. By the time he was more comfortable with his kit, the helicopters were loud and silhouetted in the night sky thanks to Chiang Rai's city lights. When the handsome dark-haired Kilburn looked up at the choppers, his heart picked up speed and excitement flooded his body. When someone tapped him on the shoulder, Kilburn looked to his left. The man that tapped the Australian on the shoulder was Win, a Royal Thai Army intelligence officer. The Thai gave him 2 thumbs up to ask if he was okay. Brad Kilburn flashed a smile in the dark that answered the question. Then with both index fingers and thumbs, Kilburn checked the foam earplugs in each ear to make sure they were secure. The two then shuffled off and took their place in a single file with the Special Forces soldiers in preparation for boarding the second aircraft. Meanwhile, the first helicopter flew low and slow along the runway as it passed the two men. The same CH-47 descended at an angle, then landed softly in the middle of the runway. The second aircraft did the same on Kilburn's left. Not long after touching asphalt, the ramp in the back of the second chopper lowered slowly. The CH-47's loadmaster, standing at the top of the ramp inside the aircraft's rear, gave the signal to board the aircraft, though Kilburn didn't see this signal as he was busy checking and adjusting his kit again. But when the shorter Thai operator in front of him moved off, Kilburn followed. In single file, they made their way toward the high-pitched squealing aircraft in a slow arc to enter it from a 6 o'clock position. The first chalk was doing the same further up the tarmac. Before reaching the helicopter's ramp, they walked through the aircraft's turbine backwash. Kilburn hadn't forgotten how shocking this could be, so had his head down as he entered the wash, which felt like walking through two gigantic blow dryers on full bore. Once through the wash, they walked up the ramp and entered the rear of the aircraft. Kilburn and his military intelligence chaperone branched off to the right and sat down on canvas seats up the front. The soldiers sat down spaced out on either side of the chopper, their weapons pointed down. From where the Australian was seated, he could see into the cockpit and over the head of the pilot, seated on the left and into the starry night sky. Kilburn let out a deep breath, leant back, closed his eyes, and aided by the hum of the CH-47, drifted off into a relaxed state. While Kilburn was in this state, the aircraft's ramp was raised slightly. Once this had been achieved, the chopper leisurely lifted vertically, hovered for a few seconds, dipped its nose, and took off in a northerly direction, following the first aircraft. The target was only minutes away. Inside the CH-47, Kilburn was mellow, on the verge of deep sleep. This chilled-out disposition was the product of the tranquil operational space he currently inhabited. This is a space where dramas of the everyday world, such as financial stress, family and relationship issues, and societal pressures do not exist. All focus is on the job at hand because operational success and life and death depend on it. Nothing else matters. The tranquil operational space is addictive, and Brad Kilburn was getting a hit. When there was another tap on Kilburn's left shoulder, he opened his eyes and tilted his head forward. They were about to land. They'd crossed the Mekong River, and in the portion of Laos that made up the notorious Golden Triangle, a wild, barely governed region. Kilburn looked out of the porthole on the opposite side of the aircraft. Gold light bursting out of the King's Roman Casino and the surrounding city shone blindingly bright. The casino's gold hotel, that shot up and out like a bush with thick trunks and had Sydney Opera House-like sails on top of each, could be seen clearly through the porthole as the chopper flew by at low altitude and speed. After the Thai aircraft passed a cluster of plain, high-rise buildings, they made a beeline toward a set of hills behind and to the right of the golden city of Vice and the mountain range that stands over it. Amongst these hills is a wide valley that is dissected by a wide dirt road. In the centre of the valley, either side of the road are plain, multi-storied buildings that are also part of the Special Economic Zone. Scattered around the valley amongst scrub, tall grass and cleared fields were fine homes. These homes had high walls around them and were guarded by armed men. The CH-47s flew into the valley from the south and swung around to the right in a slow arc and landed quickly in a cleared field. The field was south of the cluster of buildings. The potholed rough road was 30-odd metres behind the aircraft. 50 metres in front of the helicopters was high ground. The town's lighting lit the area. Once the ramp of the aircraft furthest from the buildings lowered, the Thai soldiers exited the chopper and made their way toward the town on the right. As he was walking down the ramp, Kilburn spotted 2 soldiers standing in the 5 o'clock position in reference to the chopper. These 2, with their night vision goggles flipped up on their helmets, were members of Task Force 90, the counter-terrorism unit of the Royal Thai Army. As the soldiers patrolled off toward the valley town, where they were to free and extract Thai nationals held in a fortified compound, Kilburn and Wynne married up with the counter-terrorism operators. One of the soldiers pointed toward the high ground to their left. The 2 soldiers then set off across the field toward the high ground. Kilburn and the intelligence officer followed on, just as the 2 CH-47s took to the air. Moments later, the 4 men reached the high ground. As he stopped and sucked in some air, Kilburn spotted a white, 3-storey pagoda-style roofed home with all its interior lights on. Around the house was a high white wall. The front steel gates of the home were wide open, and there was plenty of human movement inside the compound. The backdrop to this scene was a clear night sky full of bright stars. Kilburn and his escorts marched toward the house. As they did, they removed their earplugs. When they reached the entrance to the compound, immediately to their right were 2 uniformed locals who were on their knees, heads down, their hands plastic cuffed behind their backs. Kilburn presumed they were security, though his thoughts moved on quickly as he spotted and focused on a figure kneeling in gravel outside the front of the house. His hands were also secured behind his back. 2 Thai soldiers were standing either side of the figure, who was dressed in white, loose-fitting linen pants and shirt. "G'day, Kev. How you going, mate?" Kilburn inquired, as he got within a few metres of the kneeling man. The long-haired and bearded individual grinned widely, then laughed loudly when he saw Kilburn come towards him out of the dark. As Kilburn stopped and stood over the captured individual, he stopped laughing, though a wicked smile remained. The 2 men studied each other in the limited light. They sought confirmation on their thoughts and theories on one another. A split second later, Kevin Khalil said at the top of his voice in an Australian accent, "Killer! Good to finally meet ya." As his nickname passed over Khalil's lips, the thunderous delivery of the sentence, combined with Khalil's familiarity with him, rocked Kilburn a little. Before Kilburn had recovered, the kneeling man threw his head up into the night sky and howled. He then burst into laughter. The soldiers around the captured man swapped confused, concerned glances. Kilburn watched on in silence. His next response was a visceral one. He took a step forward and kicked Khalil in the solar plexus as hard as he could with his steel-cap work boot. The wind was driven out of the kneeling man, and he fell face first into the gravel. Khalil laid still for a few seconds. When he regained his breath, Khalil rolled onto his side and coughed and spluttered. He then grinned and laughed, though this time not as heartily. The captured man then asked rhetorically in a smart-ass tone, "How do you expect to have a chat and get what you came here for, if I can't breathe?" Kilburn then kicked Khalil in the chest with as much effort as he could muster. When the pain of the blow had dissipated, the detainee remarked, "I wondered how you'd react." "Now you know, don't ya?" Yeah, you're a freak like me. Now it was Kilburn's turn to grin. I'm nothing like you, mate. Kevin Khalil became angry. Don't act like them. You're not one of them. You're like me. We're the same. As his grin grew wider, Kilburn motioned with his hands for the Thai soldiers to pick up the prone man and place him back on his knees. When this was done, Khalil continued. They're all liars and fakes, schemers and deceivers. They talk it up, their values, their way of life, but when chaos comes, they quickly drop these beliefs. And once they've got what they want from you, or you don't do what they want, they'll drop you too. Kilburn chuckled before replying, Mate, I gotta say, this is a little disappointing. I thought you'd be sharper than this. The captured man returned Kilburn's grin with one of his own and said, You got me, bro. You got me. Kilburn continued. I mean, the Joker Batman scenario? Trying to get me to doubt myself and my view of the world? Send me spiralling into some sort of existential crisis? Come on, mate. I thought you'd be better than that. What were you going to say next? That they're the monsters, not you? You're not a monster? They both chuckled before Khalil added with a shrug of his shoulders, Well, I'm not. I'm just a bloke from the western suburbs trying to create a better world for us all. Yeah, through death and destruction, an unimpressed Kilburn pointed out. This is the role of the trickster, the joker, to help people pass through challenging times. Through death and destruction, countered Kilburn, as he heard helicopters circling overhead. Khalil threw back his head, howled and laughed again. Kilburn frowned and motioned with his hands to lift the prisoner up. The Thais picked Khalil up by his armpits and placed him on his feet. As this was happening, 4 soldiers with heavy canvas bags slung over their backs exited the home's front doors and made their way toward the front gates. This joker thing you got going on, it's wearing a bit thin, mate, commented a disappointed Kilburn. Come on, we're having fun, Khalil said in jest. Yeah, well, I've had enough. Come on, killer, don't be like that. Come on, what did you want to know? I don't want to know anything. I already know what I need to know. I just came to see you off, that's all, Kilburn explained as the sound of a Black Hawk helicopter grew louder. Kevin Khalil now stared at Kilburn with such intensity it made him stop and stare back just as intently. In a different situation, where the two were just average citizens, out and about doing what average citizens do, they would have ended up in a physical confrontation. Where these two came from in Melbourne's western suburbs, you don't stare someone down unless you're prepared to punch on or more. Khalil then yelled angrily with all his might. You know everything, do ya? You know fuck all. Kilburn exploded. What's to fucking know, cunt? Come on, smartass. What's to fucking know? Kevin Khalil didn't respond, he just glared. With speed, Kilburn took 2 steps forward and threw a straight right-hand punch with all his weight and momentum behind it. The blow to the bridge of the prisoner's nose sent him flying back and onto the ground with a terrific thud that could be heard over the din of the helicopter landing in the cleared field next to the compound. Kilburn stood over a buzzed Khalil and yelled over the sound of the chopper noise, If you've got something to say, say it now before they drop you into a black hole that you're never getting out of. 2 Thai operators picked Kevin Khalil up onto his feet again. They then held him up as he was still weak in the knees. Kilburn got up close to Khalil, who shook his head to shake off the haze obscuring clear thought. When his head had cleared, Khalil focused on the man in front of him and stated coldly, I am a black hole. The 2 men stared at each other again. For a split second, Kilburn felt sorry for Khalil, but empathy was quickly discarded and replaced with an emotional cocktail of controlled rage, revulsion, and relief. Good riddance, he said to himself. Just as he said that, there was another tap on Kilburn's shoulder. It was Wynne, the intelligence officer. He was alerting Kilburn to the fact that they had to go. Time was up. But just before the Thai soldiers moved Kevin Khalil on, he had one last thing to say to Kilburn. You know, Salah ad-Din didn't build an Islamic empire on one almighty decisive battle. He built it over 20-odd years through intelligent, calculated, innovative planning and campaigning. Year after year, he slowly improved his position, while at the same time, he wore down his enemies and manoeuvred them into a position for the kill. Let me give you a tip. Unrestricted degradation warfare is the future. You're fighting the last war, my friend. Never fight the last war. That sentence, never fight the last war, was on repeat and playing loud on the stereo in Brad Kilburn's head as he followed Khalil and his armed escort out of the compound. That sentence was still playing as he walked and watched Kevin Khalil being shoved into a blacked-out Black Hawk. Those words, and in Khalil's voice, were even louder in Kilburn's brain when the chopper ascended into the night sky. One of the reasons why Kevin Khalil's statement was on replay was because that's what Kilburn had said to someone in Bangkok a week or so earlier. Quote from Ulysses S. Grant, I don't underrate the value of military knowledge, but if men make war in slavish observance of rules, they will fail. War is progressive. A week or so earlier in Bangkok. When he looked out of his hotel room window, Brad Kilburn spied a sign on the building on the other side of the laneway. The small black sign and white writing in English stated, What you have been searching for so long might be under your table. He wondered for a second whether this was some sort of supernatural message from the other world and referred to his upcoming meeting only minutes away. He quickly dismissed this superstitious thought and headed out of his room. After using the lift at the end of the hallway to reach the ground floor, Kilburn passed through the tight hotel lobby, then walked out onto the laneway. Businesses in the laneway consisted of a mixture of mid-range hotels, backpacker hostels, drinking holes, massage shops and blowjob bars. There was plenty happening in the lane even though it was midday. The sky was grey and Bangkok's air was at its thickest and stickiest. Dressed in navy blue chinos and polo top, Kilburn turned left and walked off toward the ever-busy Sukhumvit Road metres away. After politely letting the ladyboy standing in the middle of the lane know that he wasn't interested in any activities with them, Kilburn turned left on the main road and headed toward the location of his important meet. The location for the meeting was a large hotel, conference and sporting complex that sat back from the street it was sprawled out on. Kilburn walked up its wide, quiet drive and headed for a set of wide steps. To get to these steps, he passed under a glass roof held up by large, round brown steel columns. On top of those columns, spread out wide and proud, were brown beams and struts, engineered to replicate the branches of a palm tree. The covered area resembled the canopy of a tropical rainforest. Kilburn stopped, looked up, and smiled in memories of times when he was a soldier. Above the glass roof stood a sign that read, Grand Hotel, Bangkok. Brad Kilburn climbed the steps and passed through the large glass sliding doors and entered the air-conditioned, glass-roofed and walled foyer. It was built just like the covered area outside. He looked up, grinned again, and moved toward the hotel's lobby, that was on the other side of the foyer. The lobby was a large hall with very little natural light. Giant chandeliers illuminated the lobby and its white marble floor. On the right, running along the wall, was the hotel desk. Opposite was a seating area where guests, mainly Indians and Arabs, sat and conversed. Kilburn checked his G-Shock watch. He was a few minutes early. As Kilburn studied the guests, a man nearing 80 years of age exited one of the lifts on the right with the aid of a walking stick. In blue jeans and a white polo shirt, the pot-bellied Keith Higginson steadily made his way toward Kilburn with a grin on his face. Kilburn grinned also, but was a little taken aback by Higo's frail state. As he walked toward the older man, he asked, "What's with the stick?" "The knee's gone. The other one's not far behind," sighed Higo. "Shit, that's no good, mate," commented Kilburn. Keith Higginson looked over his black-framed glasses and thrust out his right hand before he stopped in front of Kilburn. The two shook hands. "Where are we going for this chat?" the younger man inquired. "Upstairs. Follow me." As they strolled toward the lifts, Higginson congratulated Kilburn on obtaining his PhD. As they boarded a lift and made their way to the 5th floor and a meeting room, Higginson had a few questions on Kilburn's doctoral dissertation. After entering the timber-panelled meeting room that looked over the expansive pool area, the Australians made their way to the dining table in the centre of the room. On the left-hand wall were cupboards and drawers. Before sitting down at the table, Kilburn joked, "Well, thanks for reading my thesis. You're about the only one who did." Higginson chuckled as he hung up his walking stick on a chair and sat down on another carefully. "I don't agree with everything in it, but it was bloody good work anyway. Especially the research you conducted in Indonesia. Very impressive. It's just too bad that it didn't lead anywhere career-wise for you," commented Higo as he surveyed plates of food on the table. "I knew that going in, so it's not that big a deal," Kilburn replied philosophically. "Still, I'm sure you want to apply that knowledge and experience." "Absolutely," Kilburn answered with conviction. "Well, maybe I can help you with that," Higginson said as he picked up a cheese and tomato sandwich from the plate in front of him. Kilburn raised his eyebrows, but not his hopes. He'd been in so many situations where he was on the verge of work, where he could apply all his experience, skills and knowledge, all for it to disappear just as rapidly as it appeared. This situation was no different, and most likely to go nowhere, he thought, as he watched Higo tuck into his sandwich. Even the free flight and accommodation supplied by the man sitting opposite him hadn't got Kilburn's expectations up. Higginson emailing him and making such a gesture should have sent his excitement levels through the roof. This is because the older man was a Vietnam veteran with 2 tours under his infantry soldier's bush belt and a military intelligence master who did a Thai language course before many were born. From there he went into the Australian Secret Intelligence Service and eventually became Chief of Intelligence there in Bangkok for a few years. After his government service, Higginson went into business in Thailand. Next came academia, approaching and passing retirement age. Higo also had a PhD. Lecturing at Melbourne's Monash University is where he encountered Kilburn for the second time. When Higginson had finished with a mouthful of food, Kilburn said, "Go on, you were saying?" "Well, here's the thing. There's been an interesting development in this part of the world," Higo stated as he reached for another sandwich. "Go on." "Well..." The older man took another mouthful of food, leaving Kilburn in suspense. After he gulped down part of the sandwich, Higginson continued. "You know Kevin Khalil?" "Not personally, but yeah, The bloke from the western suburbs of Melbourne who joined Islamic State. Of course. Well, it just so happens that one of his couriers/odd jobs man has been spotted here in Thailand. No shit, replied an intrigued Kilburn. Yeah. Do you reckon this bloke's raising funds here, or linking up with affiliated Islamic State groups in Southeast Asia for future operations? Or maybe setting up some sort of transportation training hub for wannabe jihadis? Or maybe he's just here on holiday, Kilburn hypothesised. The last theory made Higginson stare at the younger man over his glasses and say, I don't think he's here on holidays, mate. What then? We suspect he's here. Who? Khalil. That's what the intelligence suggests. How, where and why? Kilburn inquired sceptically, but fully immersed in the moment. How? Well, we think he may have come overland, from the Mid-East to Afghanistan, through the subcontinent, Burma to here. The where and why is yet to be known. Interesting, commented Kilburn, as he furiously mulled over reasons why Kevin Khalil would be in Thailand. At the moment, all we know is that his messenger has been seen interacting with organised crime elements here in Thailand. Kilburn's attention peaked. Higginson added, bikies especially. From Australia, I bet, stated the younger man. Yeah, that's right. A split second later, it dawned on Kilburn why he was there. The older man required his knowledge and information gathering capabilities within the outlaw motorcycle gang scene. Mate, if you wanted some info on bikies, you didn't have to fly me all the way over here. There's modern technology, you know, Kilburn commented with a wry smile. Higginson laughed at the younger man's confusion before remarking, I didn't fly you over here for some intelligence on outlaw motorcycle gangs. Then what then? I flew you out here because I think you'd be ideal to help us in our inquiries to track down Kevin Khalil. Me? Now Kilburn was really confused. Yeah, you, Higo replied while eyeing off some fresh fruit. What about all these intelligence gurus, the feds, what are they doing? The older man moved his right hand as if brushing away an invisible fly and added, Don't worry about them. What do you mean, don't worry about them? Kilburn said. 2 seconds went by before the younger man asked, Is this your own personal operation you got going on here? Yeah, no, Higginson replied as he reached for a slice of mango. What the fuck does that mean? Kilburn became alarmed and could envision a long term in a Thai prison. Listen, you'll be protected while you're here. No one is asking you to break the law or do anything that might put you in danger. You're just here to gather information, that's all. This statement by the older man relieved some, but not all the stress building up in Kilburn's chest. Knowing the strength of Kilburn's concerns, Higginson outlaid what he wanted his former student to do. I just think you'd be perfect to work the outlaw motorcycle gang angle of this operation. You have hands-on experience in that world, that's all. You also know Thailand and Southeast Asia. You have an in-depth knowledge on terrorism and terrorism in Southeast Asia. You know organised crime. Higo didn't finish the rest of his spiel. He knew Kilburn would fill in the blanks, and he did. Once he'd done that, Kilburn got up off his chair and walked toward the glass doors that divided the room and the balcony. As he looked out over the pool framed by lush lawns and gardens, he took a breath. He was exhilarated, but shit scared at the same time. Both emotions were duking it out inside him to see who would take possession of his prospects. It didn't take long for exhilaration to win the emotional contest. Exhilaration knocked out fear, and trepidation was crowned champion because it drew strength from Kilburn's inner fanatical obsession, fulfilling his potential. As Brad Kilburn checked out a couple of fit-bodied young women taking selfies on sunbeds below, he started to think of where he would start his inquiries. He was still not 100% on board with the operation when he turned around, but he had come up with a first step and wanted to run it by Higo. However, the older man was a step ahead and asked with a knowing smile, "So where do you think you'll start?" As he stood in front of the glass doors, Kilburn frowned and wondered whether Higginson was reading his thoughts. He then recollected how experienced his former lecturer was. With that cleared up, the younger man answered the question with a question. "You intelligence investigative types always say follow the money, right?" Still smiling, Higginson gave a slight nod. He was intrigued and eager to know what Kilburn had come up with so quickly. "Well, I reckon in this case, instead of following the money, you follow fast women. Hot, fast Thai women in this case. Follow them and you'll find your outlaw motorcycle gang leaders. And where you find them, you'll find Courier Boy." Kilburn didn't finish the rest of his theory. He let Higo fill in the rest. "Well, that's different," commented the older man as he reached for another piece of fruit. While Higginson ate, Kilburn second-guessed his theory. The older man finished eating and said, "All right, why not? Let's see how it goes. Should be interesting. That's what all this is about, isn't it? You looking for something interesting to do? You being bored shitless in retirement? You looking for a kick? You picked up on Khalil's possible presence here through your contacts and thought you'd run an op to fill the emptiness of retired life. Am I wrong?" The older man said nothing. He just grinned and looked out over his glasses at a cocky Kilburn, who added, "This is you taking a victory lap before shuffling off this mortal coil." Nothing was said for a second. Then Higginson asked, "So I guess you know a fast Thai woman who can aid us in our inquiries?" "I do, in Phuket," Kilburn explained. "Good. Let's get you on the next plane," the older man said as he got up off his chair. Higo grabbed his stick and walked over to a cupboard on his left and pulled out a black backpack. He placed the backpack on the table and pushed it toward the younger man. "Open it. Make sure everything's in it," commanded Higginson. Kilburn unzipped the bag. In it he found a large paper envelope. In that he found cash, Thai baht, US and Australian dollars. There was also an Australian passport for Kilburn under another name. With it were bank cards and licences. A folding tactical multi-use knife was also in the envelope. Last was a mobile phone and brightly coloured packets of SIM cards for use in multiple Southeast Asian countries. "Start up that phone and do a comms check," the older man instructed. Kilburn pulled the phone out of the envelope and placed the package back in the backpack and zipped it up. On the phone, Kilburn found an encrypted app to be used for the operation. After messages were swapped, Kilburn placed the phone in a pocket in his pants. As he was doing this, Higginson noted, "In the phone you'll find a file that documents Khalil's early years right through to his militant activities. You'll find it extensive and in-depth. There's also some photos and film as well." "Cool. I knew you'd like that," replied the older man. As he picked up the backpack, Kilburn asked, "That's it then?" "Almost. I want you to meet someone downstairs first." Higginson then made a brief phone call. Kilburn threw the backpack over his shoulder. They headed downstairs. Once on the ground floor, they walked out of the hotel's noisy lobby and headed for a bar on the right. The bar was bordered by dark brown and oxblood red panels. The carpet was oxblood red as well. The Australians walked into the bar and sat down at one of the square tables in a corner, which gave them a good view of their surrounds and who walked by or entered the bar. Kilburn placed his backpack on the floor next to him. Framed on the wall near them were gold, ornately decorated weapons, a musket, samurai sword and scimitar. There were no staff or patrons. It was quiet. "So I'm still dirty on you for giving me that B+ on that essay," Kilburn remarked to shatter the silence. Higo adjusted his glasses and glared at the man sitting opposite him. All this globalisation, global complexity stuff, scoffed Higo. It's ahistorical, technological-centric nonsense. When Brad Kilburn took this subject, Intelligence and International Relations, as part of his Masters in Counter-Terrorism Studies, Higginson was the lecturer. Kilburn's major essay argued that kinship and marriage were counterintelligence strategies used by global jihadist networks. Higginson agreed but knocked down Kilburn's mark due to his overemphasis on globalisation and global networks in the paper. Recalling this, Kilburn shook his head and quipped, "Never fight the last war, mate." Before Higo could return serve, a well-groomed subcontinent man in a suit and tie entered the bar and made his way toward the seated men. Both stood up. The man was tall and had soft hands, Kilburn noticed as he shook hands with him. "This is Amir. He's a friend from the Pakistan embassy," Higo explained. Kilburn nodded his head. In impeccable English, Amir commented, "I've heard a lot about you. It's good to finally meet you and put a face to a name." After that sentence, Kilburn understood what this little meeting was for, to get an in-person impression. "No worries. Good to meet you and glad to hear I didn't disappoint," Kilburn replied with a smile. There was an awkward pause. Then Higginson turned to Kilburn. "I'll give you a ring later." Kilburn gave both men a nod, picked up his black backpack and left the bar. As he watched him walk off, Amir gave his approval. "He looks like a likely type." "He is," replied a chuckling Higo before adding, "Don't worry, he'll knock a few heads together, stab someone, and hold a gun to someone's head before this is through." Both men grinned. "Perfect," remarked Amir. Quote from Alain de Botton: "Until one is close to death, it must be difficult to declare anyone as the love of one's life." When his taxi pulled up outside his hotel in Patong Beach on the island of Phuket in southern Thailand, Brad Kilburn laughed at the hotel's name. The sign that hung above the hotel's front glass doors read, "How's the Serenity?" Under and behind the sign stood a white, four-storey building that sat at the end of a cul-de-sac amongst cheap housing for locals. Once out of the taxi, Kilburn threw on his backpack and pulled his dive bag out of the vehicle's boot. He then wandered into the hotel's lobby. When he noticed that no one was manning the counter on the left, Kilburn dropped his bag. He turned to his right and walked through the lobby and into an open area. There, lush bright green lawn surrounded a rectangular swimming pool. On the other side of the pool was a bar sheltered by a thatched roof. "Can I help you?" a man asked in an Australian accent. Kilburn turned around to see a short, bald man who wore shorts and singlet. "Yeah, mate, I'm here to check in." "You're Higo's man." "That's me," Kilburn replied. After collecting his key from the bald man, Kilburn went to his room and threw his bag on the bench against the wall. Kilburn's next move was to send a message to a Thai woman living locally on his ops phone. As he predicted, there was no immediate answer to the message, so Kilburn threw on his board shorts and went for a swim in the pool. Once refreshed, Kilburn jumped out of the pool, grabbed his ops phone off a sun lounge and sat down on a stool at the unused bar. From where he sat, Kilburn had a view of the road, the hotel and pool area. Seconds after sitting down, Kilburn decided that it was an opportune time to start uncovering and dissecting the mind and times of Kevin Khalil. So he opened the file on Khalil on the ops phone that had been compiled by multiple Australian government departments. The first thing that stood out about a young Kevin Khalil was his multiple identities. He was born in Fiji to a Fijian Indian Muslim father and a Thai Buddhist mother. The family moved to Melbourne when he was a toddler. From this information, it was assumed that Khalil grew up engaging in multiple cultures at home, then lived another in the broader community. This situation left the young Khalil stuck between many identities, and most likely not having one at all, which resulted in alienation. The second thing that stood out in the file was that the Khalil family did not practice or engage in any religious activity. "That's interesting," Kilburn said to himself as he looked up and watched a couple of locals walk off the street and into the hotel. Kilburn exited out of the Khalil file and placed his phone on the bar. He looked at the pool and its beckoning cool blue water and decided to go for another swim. When he finished his swim, Kilburn was famished and decided to go for a feed. Once showered and changed into a pair of green chino shorts and a black t-shirt, Kilburn left the hotel and walked up its street for a few minutes before coming to a thin, busy road. On the corner on the left was a drinking hole. As he entered the venue, Kilburn was met by a young, attractive local woman in a tiny dress. She looked him up and down, then smiled to reveal a mouth crowded with braces. "Can I eat here?" Kilburn inquired. She nodded and turned on her heels and headed toward the bar that was rectangular and occupied the centre of the establishment. She reached for one of the menus stacked up on top of the bar. As she did, Kilburn headed toward a tall stool in the corner of the venue that looked out over the road. As he sat down, the young woman placed a menu down on the wooden counter in front of him. He ordered, then pulled the ops phone out of a pocket in his shorts and checked it for messages. Nothing. The Thai woman who Kilburn was looking to gain information from had not responded. The non-response to his message gave Kilburn great pain. This pain was caused by continued rejection and jealousy and exploded out of his heart and tightened his chest. He took a deep breath, then chided himself for still harbouring feelings for this woman. Now he was fuming and irrational. All sorts of crazy thoughts zipped around inside his head. "Burn everything to the ground. Kill 'em all. Kill every single fucking one of 'em," his wounded soul commanded. By the time he'd eaten his local dish, Kilburn had cooled. But when a beefy bloke covered in tats pulled up and parked out the front of the bar on a Harley Davidson with a hot Thai girl on the back, he was livid. He was seething because he could imagine the Thai woman he was there to see getting around the island with a man and on a bike like that. She was living such a life when they first met. As the big bloke and his local lady dismounted the Harley and took off their helmets, Kilburn paid for his meal at the bar. As he passed the two on his way out, they studied him suspiciously. He walked on and back to his hotel. The next morning, Kilburn was laying in bed in his hotel when he reached for the ops phone charging on the table by the bed. He checked the phone for messages. There was no response from the Thai woman. Sarah. "Looks like I'm going to have to force the issue," he said to himself. He sent another detailed message, then made up his mind. "If I don't get an answer by tonight, I'm going down to her hotel first thing tomorrow morning." Now that he had a plan, Kilburn opened the Kevin Khalil file on the phone, still in his hand. What was even more interesting than the Khalil family being non-religious was that Kevin Khalil's father was an alcoholic. It was also believed by authorities that the father severely beat both his wife and sons regularly. Kilburn wondered what the psychological ramifications would be for a young Khalil in such a household. In Khalil's psych assessment was an answer. Regular and intense beatings of a child can lead to intense self-loathing and a belief that they are evil. The child also learns to offload self-hate and rage onto others through the violence of his father. In the assessment, it also mentioned that abused family members become extremely close. This closeness includes overprotection and intense devotion from the mother, the result of which for the children can be inflated self-importance. Along with this, Abused children can also grow up fantasizing about being their family member's defender, their champion. When he read all of this, Kilburn opened a video stored on the phone. In an Islamic State propaganda video, a furious Khalil, dressed in black and holding an AK-47, calls on all good Muslims to join him in his righteous war against the enemies of Islam, who he accuses of abusing and dishonouring Muslim women and children. When the following morning arrived, Kilburn marched into the lobby of his hotel and asked to borrow the bald man's grey Ford ute parked out the front. Keys in hand, Kilburn jumped into and drove the utility with purpose toward a beach on the other side of the island. This postcard crescent-shaped beach was still. Traditional Thai fishing boats anchored just offshore rocked up and down gently on the calm Andaman Sea. The sky was a multitude of greys. As Kilburn drove along the road that hugged the beach, he scanned to his left for somewhere to park amongst the cafes and restaurants. He found a spot and parked nose out in front of a hotel opposite the beach. Once out of the vehicle, Brad Kilburn walked over to the beach and stepped out along its footpath. His heart pumped faster. She was close. Where the road and beach parted ways, a wide dirt track bordered and roofed by great trees continued to contour the beach. Kilburn darted off the footpath and strode along the dirt track. Metres later, he encountered a Thai boxing gym on the right. Under the gym's high roof, a mixed group shadow boxed. Adjoining the gym was a hotel. The white hotel was of mid-century design, and reflecting off its large, clean glass windows was the picturesque surrounds. At first, Kilburn was happy for Sarah. She'd built her dream business and home. They'd spent hours together in Melbourne and Southeast Asia, checking out modernist architecture. Mid-century design was a passion they shared. Now she'd gone and done it, and built one. He was proud of her. But as he walked by the hotel's pool on his way to the lobby, rage consumed him. She'd share that passion with someone else. That was our thing, he said internally. Now she shared it with her idiot husband. Fuck her. By the pool, reclined back on a sun lounge, was the beefy bloke from the day before. Kilburn looked to his left and made eye contact with the big bloke briefly. The sight of the same man from the previous day jolted Kilburn and forced him to focus on the task at hand before he entered the hotel's tiny lobby. Behind the varnished timber counter in the lobby was a local woman in a white uniform. Standing behind her was Sarah. When she'd realised who'd walked through the door, Sarah's large, dark, intense eyes grew wider. A huge, heart-stopping smile spread across her face. However, the initial visceral explosion of joy she felt at seeing Kilburn again was quickly replaced by overwhelming dread and apprehension. Her smile morphed into a nervous one. Her instincts told her to run. She sprinted into the office behind the counter and closed the door. Kilburn laughed and said to the woman in white, "She's such a coward." With poise, the woman retorted, "Would you like to leave a message?" Kilburn replied loud enough for all to hear, "Tell her to come and see me, otherwise I'll be back every day till she does." As he finished his sentence, Kilburn imagined Sarah standing behind the office door, listening intently to the goings-on. Then, thinking he'd got his message across, Kilburn turned to leave. As he did, he saw the beefy bloke making his way toward the lobby with determination. Kilburn moved with speed through the door. He stopped and put his right foot a little in front of the other in preparation for a physical clash. The big bloke stopped in his tracks. The thick gold chain swinging around his thick neck thudded into his chest. He almost put his hands up, but checked himself and placed them by his side. The beefy bloke stared at Kilburn with uncertain green eyes. Draymond, someone yelled from above. The big bloke looked up 2 stories to see his Thai girlfriend leaning over a balcony. Her large fake breast bulged out over her black swimsuit top. Can you grab my towel and bring it up with you? Draymond spun around and headed toward the sun lounge next to his. Kilburn moved on. Kilburn was drinking a beer by his hotel's pool that afternoon when he received a message from Sarah. She would meet him there tomorrow. Partly satisfied, Kilburn sunk a few more beers. As he drank those beers, he felt hungry and something was nagging at him. Why was Draymond at that bar on the corner? What's the connection? He asked himself. His empty gut and curiosity got the better of him, so he walked to the bar and sat in a corner overlooking the entrance and street. Just after his bum hit the seat, a female staff member placed a menu in front of him. Before inspecting the menu, Kilburn looked above at the thick wooden beam running across the front of the establishment. On the beam was a round sticker the size of a saucer. On the sticker, set out the same as on the back of a leather vest, were the colours, lettering and symbol of the Australian-born outlaw motorcycle gang, the Ming City Renegades. On top, in gold and in Wild West font, read Ming City Renegades. Below, same font, same colour, was Phuket Platoon. In the centre was the highly recognisable emblem of the OMCG, jokingly known as the Flying Viking. Flying up to the right with speed is a winged, husky-bearded man wearing medieval garb and helmet. In his meaty hands, he grips and fires an Australian designed and manufactured automatic weapon, the Owen gun. With a wry smile, Kilburn lowered his eyes and perused the menu. He got an answer to the question he'd raised earlier. Midway through the next day, Kilburn was standing under the thatched roof that protected the unused bar of his hotel. It was a seriously hot day. The tropical sun was at its searing peak. Kilburn stood there resisting the temptation to check his watch. Sarah was 20 minutes late. He suspected she was balking at meeting up. His edginess got the better of him, so he sent her a message. It read, "Are you turning up? If not, I'll find you." His message was answered immediately. She was on her way. 5 minutes later, a blacked-out, jacked-up Dodge Ram utility rolled slowly into a car spot outside the hotel. The driver's side door opened, and the petite Sarah jumped out of the vehicle. In black tight shorts and tight red singlet, she wandered over toward Kilburn slowly. When she got within a few metres of him, excitement got the better of all her negative emotions. She expanded her chest to take in a deep breath, which highlighted her large natural breasts. A huge, gorgeous smile lit up her face. Her dark eyes were wide and emotion-filled, all of which were the result of the passionate past between the two. Then her demeanour changed with a blink of her eyes. She was outraged. "Did I say you could come and see me?" she spat. "I don't need your permission," Kilburn fired back. "Do you know the trouble you've caused me?" "Yep." Kilburn knew Sarah's cashed-up, bogan, bikey clientele would be unsettled by him sniffing around their tropical sanctuary. Sarah's mood changed again. She grinned and said in a smart-ass tone, "Anyway, good to see you." "Yeah, good to see you too," Kilburn replied in a similar tone. Both laughed. She came close to Kilburn and wrapped her arms around him and gave him a long, strong hug. After a couple of seconds, he wrapped his arms around her. When they finally let go of each other, Sarah looked up at Kilburn and asked, "So what's this business you want to discuss?" "I need more information on MCR, the Ming City Renegades here in Thailand." Sarah screwed up her face. "Why? Why do you want to know about them?" "Business. Believe me, You don't want to deal with these people, Sarah cautioned. I need more names and places than I already have. The Thai woman growled and raised her hands that she'd formed into paws and claws. You drive me crazy, she stated through gritted teeth. Kilburn laughed. Why are you doing this to me? A hurt and confused Sarah inquired as she crossed her arms. This is not about us. This is business. And if you don't give me the information I want, I'll fuck that deal you have with that idiot wannabe gangster husband of yours. Sarah growled again, uncrossed her arms, and thrust her claws up at Kilburn before feigning ripping his face off. Settle down, relax, Kilburn said with a smile. She crossed her arms and looked at the ground. After some careful thought, Sarah told Kilburn everything she knew about MCR, and as a bonus, gave him the contact details of individuals that could help him further his inquiries. Happy now? A surly Sarah asked. Sure am, a smug Kilburn replied. They hugged strongly again. When they let go of each other, Sarah took a big step back and looked at Kilburn as if he were a freshly cooked Thai dish ready to be devoured. I better go, she announced, before something happens. The smile on Kilburn's face as he watched Sarah turn and walk away was the result of warm satisfaction. She still loved him and nobody else. Shortly after Sarah left his hotel, Kilburn sat at the hotel's bar and booked a flight to Bangkok for the following afternoon. However, Bangkok wasn't his destination. He messaged Keith Higginson and let him know he was on his way to Pattaya, the party city southeast of the capital. Once all his administration had been done, Kilburn took a deep breath and decided he needed a beer. As he started to walk toward the hotel's lobby, where there was a fridge full of grog, his ops phone received a message. He pulled the phone from his shorts pocket and read the message. It was Sarah. She wanted to meet later. By the time Kilburn walked down onto Patong Beach, the sun had set. The tide was out, and the wet sand and sea were indigo blue, while the hills encircling the beach were midnight blue. The lower half of the sky was royal blue. The higher half was a mixture of swirling scattered white and royal blue cloud. Stars were starting to appear high above. As Kilburn watched the calm sea roll up onto the beach, he felt guilty about threatening Sarah's current situation. That's as good as it gets for her, he told himself, and you might have fucked it for her. Well done, dickhead. Kilburn grimaced and did what he did from time to time, contemplated what might have been for him and Sarah. Loneliness and melancholy took hold of his soul. He was emotionally flat and forgot why he was there when he spotted Sarah walking toward him. Hey, sorry for not getting back to you sooner, Sarah said as she stopped in front of Kilburn. No worries, I understand. I know, I never had to explain myself to you. You know me. Both grinned. Sarah continued. Thank you for everything you did for me. Thanks for all your help over the years. She paused for a second. But don't come into my life ever again, okay? Sarah wrapped her arms around Kilburn's neck and gave him a kiss on the lips. She locked eyes with him for a second, let go, then turned and strolled off along the beach. Kilburn stood like a statue. Sarah never looked back. Quote from Robert Greene. Where an individual can be bold and creative, a group is often afraid of risk. In Pattaya, Brad Kilburn walked along the footpath that hugged the beach. Lack of shade and a too wide beach with coarse sand gave the area a hostile feel. Adding to the hostility was the soul-sapping heat and humidity. It was no surprise there was no one swimming or kicking back on the sand. Powerboats for water sports were still and anchored just offshore. As he strolled, Kilburn looked over the road for a cafe to sit down and relax in. Up ahead, He found a place with high and wide front windows next door to a McDonald's. Kilburn walked up the steps of the cafe, entered the ice-cold air-conditioned venue and ordered an iced coffee. After receiving his beverage, he took a seat overlooking the beach. Halfway through his coffee, he spotted a bewildered, exhausted young man stomping past the cafe in a singlet and board shorts. The thick but unfit man was bent over and had his head down when he looked into the cafe. He turned away quickly and continued on his way when he spotted Kilburn, who noted the young man's physical characteristics. These included traditional Polynesian tattoos on his upper arms and shoulders. When Kilburn finished his iced coffee, he left the cafe and walked back to his accommodation, the Golden Ocean Hotel. This large hotel sat behind some shop houses on a narrow, busy road lined with bars, restaurants, hotels and massage shops. Kilburn walked into the laneway and entrance to his hotel, then turned right and into the hotel's spacious lobby. Next, he took the lift to the second floor. On that floor, he entered his spacious room, whose balcony overlooked the pool. After a shower, he flopped onto his bed and opened the file on Kevin Khalil on his ops phone. In his teens, Khalil found trouble on the streets of Melbourne's western suburbs. He fell in with a street gang that fought other gangs with fists and whatever weapons they could find or fashion. In one of these clashes in a shopping centre car park late at night, 2 young men were killed. Assaults, robbery and destruction of property were crimes Khalil was convicted of in his teens. The future Islamic State operative found family, power, praise and protection in a street gang that he was unable to find at home. On the streets, he would also find an outlet for his rage and rebellion against authority. These activities he dared not dabble in at home. In contrast, Khalil's school marks were constantly well above average right up until he finished secondary school. Maths and science were subjects he excelled at. Kevin's school report stated that he was intelligent, inquisitive and hard-working. A curious Kilburn closed the file on his phone and tossed it onto the bed beside him. What was with Khalil's good marks in school? Kilburn asked himself. A few seconds later, he had the answer to his question. He remembered reading early in Khalil's psych assessment that intense devotion from the mother also results in rapid and exceptional learning. By the time Kilburn got off his bed, it was dark and time to go out. Half an hour later, a showered and shaved Kilburn exited his hotel wearing a black polo shirt and tan shorts. He walked down the lane toward the main road. However, before reaching the road, Kilburn spotted a lump of a man sitting on a motorbike over the road in front of a shop. It was the same young man with the Polynesian tattoos from earlier in the day. He appeared out on his feet and was not looking in Kilburn's direction. Kilburn slipped into the shadows beside the hotel and observed the young guy for a few seconds. The young man glanced into the laneway once. Kilburn turned and walked back up the lane. Behind his hotel was a road running parallel to the main road. He turned onto this road and disappeared into a dark alley. In the alley, outside a double-storey home, under a tree and behind thick green bushes, Kilburn waited to see if he was followed. In his right hand, he held his unfolded tactical knife. No one stumbled into his ambush. He moved on and jumped onto the back of a moto taxi he found on a street corner. The moto taxi dropped Kilburn off at the entrance of a popular entertainment area that was L-shaped. Either side of the L-shaped street were your average expat bar, nightclubs, and colourfully lit and named girly bars. Loud music of all genres was thundering out of each venue. Out the front of these bars on the street, drinking at long tables, were plenty of holidayers and retirees from Western Europe and Australia. Most were male, divorced, or the wife was dead or didn't care. Their kids were grown up and had their own lives. Now Dad was living large and in colour in Thailand to make up for 50-odd years of monotony and boredom in the burbs. As he strolled down the middle of the street, passing by these men in shorts and sandals, and scantily clad Thai women looking to entice men into their venues, Kilburn soaked in the atmosphere with a wicked grin. When he reached a 90-degree bend in the street, he pivoted left and sat down at a table outside the Bandicoot, a bar that occupied the inner bend of the precinct. At the table, Kilburn had an unobstructed view of the entire area. A local cover band inside the Bandicoot was pumping out some classic tunes when a female staff member approached and asked Kilburn what he'd like to drink. He ordered a beer and told the staff member he was there to catch up with the bar's manager, Penn. A few minutes later, an attractive Thai woman in her 30s stood next to Brad Kilburn. She wore a tight white dress that was juxtaposed to her jet black hair that was cut like Queen Cleopatra's. Kilburn looked her up and down before saying, "Penn, I presume?" She smiled and put out her hand. They shook hands. As they did, Kilburn stared into her dark eyes that were as shiny and dark as her black locks. Penn took a seat next to the Australian and ordered herself a vodka lime and soda. By the time Penn's drink arrived, her and Kilburn had built up a strong rapport. Her cool, smooth thigh was pressed up against his, and she placed her hand on his leg when he made her laugh. The only time they disengaged from their electric connection was when two drunks stumbled out of the Monte Carlo Casino Go-Go Club opposite. The two men yelled and fell multiple times before entering another bar nearby. Moments later, Penn got up off her stool and made her way inside the Bandicoot to attend to some venue-related issues. Meanwhile, Kilburn scanned the area. Then someone caught his eye. Walking out of Smasher's Bar, a hard man's hangout, over the road, was a bloke of Middle Eastern descent. He was tall, athletically built, had a neatly trimmed beard, wore a black Nike cap, shorts and runners, and a plain white t-shirt. Strapped over his shoulder across his upper body was a Louis Vuitton belt bag. Not only did he superficially look out of place, but his all-business body language stood out as well. Kilburn's instant gut reaction was that this man was Kevin Khalil's courier. As the same man strode past him, this reaction intensified tenfold. As Kilburn watched the Nike-clad man disappear up the road, he hit the wall of reality with a thud. The result of this psychological collision was the sharp and clear realisation that he was a hunter on the trail of a dangerous international terrorist, not a tourist on a lark. As soon as Penn sat back down, he told her that he was seeking the highest-ranking member of the Ming City Renegades in Thailand, who he knew resided in Pattaya. Her head spun round, and she stared at him. Kilburn's sudden emotional shift gave her a start. "So who's his Thai girlfriend?" he asked. 10 o'clock the next morning, Kilburn was sitting at a table eating scrambled eggs on toast outside a restaurant that was popular with retired expats. Toward the end of his meal, a young local woman walked off the street and into the eatery and ordered some food to go. She wore a tight t-shirt, jean shorts, and had large fake breasts and lips. Kilburn looked at his watch. The young woman met the description passed on to him by Penn. It was also the time and place Penn said he'd find her most days. After she paid and took possession of her food that came in a plastic bag, the woman made her way over the road to a coffee stand and ordered once again. As she waited, Kilburn sent a message on his ops phone, then paid his bill. Once she received her coffee, the woman walked up the road. Over the road, Kilburn followed her, using street stalls, signs, people, and power poles as close cover. Metres up the road, the woman turned left and out of view. By the time Kilburn caught sight of the woman again, she was walking down a ramp and into an underground car park of a massive hotel complex. Kilburn retreated and made a phone call outside a convenience store that stood opposite the hotel. Moments later, a local bloke on a motor scooter pulled up outside the store. Kilburn gave him a nod. His gesture was returned. Both had a good view of the entrance to the car park. They waited for a couple of minutes before a gold Ford four-wheel drive drove up the ramp out of the car park with the targeted woman driving. As she turned the Ford onto the busy road, Kilburn's local colleague started his scooter and followed the four-wheel drive. Satisfied with the morning's outcome, Kilburn made his way back to his accommodation. Instead of entering his hotel from the multiple avenues behind it, he approached from the main road. As he was about to turn into the laneway that led to his hotel, Kilburn spotted the bulky young man with tattoos who'd been stalking him. He was sitting on his motorbike, staring at the phone in his hand, when he happened to look up and see Kilburn. His eyes widened and his body stiffened. The young man then attempted to look natural, which made Kilburn chuckle. Kilburn was still amused when he got to his room. By the time he'd changed and made his way to the pool area, Kilburn was thinking about the tattooed young man sweating it out over the road while he was about to go for a swim. He grinned and threw his gear onto a sun chair and dove into the pool. As Kilburn treaded water, he speculated on Kevin Khalil's next step on the road to extremism. Intrigued on what that may look like, Kilburn jumped out of the pool, spread out his towel on a sun chair and reclined back on it. He then opened the Khalil file on his phone. Even though his home life was horrific, Kevin Khalil managed to finish secondary school and gain a place at university to study civil engineering. At university, Khalil joined the Student Union and Socialist Club and became an active member of both. But due to a clash of egos, he left both organisations acrimoniously. Kilburn doubted bumping heads was the only reason why Khalil left these groups. Most likely, Khalil didn't find what he was seeking in these organisations, such as family, a greater self and understanding of the world. This was seen through his entry and exit of a variety of clubs and organisations at university and outside it. Kilburn was going to read on, but loud Middle Eastern music emanating from a room above the pool area distracted him. Kilburn put down his phone and looked up over the pool to the room. There, a Middle Eastern middle-aged man was dancing with 4 Thai women and a glass of whiskey in his hand. Watching the man party like a Babylonian king reminded Kilburn that he needed a beer and a feed, so he got up and went back to his room. Kilburn left his hotel via the main entrance. As he did, he gave the tattooed young man a wave, who was sitting in the shade on the front step of a shop, phone in hand. The young bloke froze. Shock and confusion took hold of him. Kilburn moved on to the Joker bar down the road. Wanting to be seen, Kilburn sat down under the bar's large sign. On the sign was the iconic image of the comic book villain the Joker. Kilburn picked this bar because it was owned by the Ming City Renegades. 2 beers and a feed later, and with the sun about to set, he paid his bill and went for a walk. Not far from the Joker bar was a shopping centre that had been ravaged by the pandemic. When Kilburn entered the 4-storied circular complex's court, He noticed that the grass and trees needed trimming and the ponds were stagnant, and the white building needed plenty of paint. Water stains ran down the walls. The only shops open were a couple of restaurants and a tattoo shop on the ground floor. Kilburn walked through the court and to the right and climbed the stationary escalator to the second level. On that level, he entered a dark and narrow corridor. At the end of the corridor was a set of toilets that he disappeared into. Seconds later, two Thai men in shorts and singlets and the young bloke that had been conducting surveillance on Kilburn appeared at the top of the escalator on level 2. The three walked down the same hallway Kilburn entered. Right behind them was a determined Raymond, the MCR member who Kilburn had encountered at Sarah's Hotel in Phuket. All four men searched the men's and then the women's toilets. However, Kilburn was nowhere to be had. Outside the toilets in the corridor, the four men looked at each other perplexed. Then Draymond sparked up. "Let's keep looking around. He's fucking here somewhere." The four were 3/4 down the hallway when they observed Kilburn walk into and stand silhouetted at the entrance of the corridor. The four men stopped in their tracks. A second later, one of the Thais stepped forward and strode confidently toward Kilburn. The muscular legs and scar tissue around the oncoming Thai's eyes let Kilburn know that he was facing a Thai boxer. Knowing that this was not a sporting contest and a street fight, Kilburn anticipated that the Thai would go for a knockout with his first strike, and that would be a head kick with his left leg from a southpaw stance. Kilburn was correct. When the Thai had measured the correct distance between him and Kilburn for a head kick, the local shaped up in a southpaw stance and threw the knockout blow. However, just as the Thai unleashed the powerful strike, Kilburn stepped forward to close the distance. The local man's knee smashed into Kilburn's upper arm. As it did, Kilburn caught the Thai's leg with the same arm. He lifted the leg and drove forward. The Thai hopped up and down and backward on his free leg and laughed as he did. At the same time, Kilburn pulled out his knife from his left pocket, flicked out the blade, and then proceeded to furiously stab the Thai to the inside of his thigh multiple times. Blood gushed and poured from the stab wounds. Kilburn threw the Thai boxer into the other local and the tattooed young bloke, who were standing side by side and corralled by the narrow corridor. The two stepped back in fright and the injured Thai fell flat on his back. His head made a dull thud as it hit the concrete floor. Those two then turned and ran toward the toilets. As they did, they almost bowled over Draymond, who was stuck to the spot. Kilburn marched toward the MCR member with a bloodied knife in his hand. When he was in arm's length of Draymond, Kilburn reached out with his right hand and ripped off the thick gold chain hanging around the man's thick neck. Once it was in his possession, Kilburn stepped forward and gave Draymond a short, crisp, but powerful headbutt to the bridge of his nose. The bulky bloke let out a cry, grabbed at his face, and bent at the waist. In the limited light, Kilburn held up the chain and inspected the gold, chunky flying Viking hanging from it. Satisfied, Kilburn turned and walked off. He kicked the prone, groaning injured Thai in the head as he went. The following day, Kilburn stood in a contained shadow at the back of a bar that had been abandoned. On the other side of the laneway the bar stood on, brilliantly lit by the midday sun, was a small tattoo shop called Outlaws Inc. A gold Ford four-wheel drive pulled up outside the tattoo shop. Jumping out of the driver's side of the Ford wearing gold-framed sunglasses, a white singlet and jean shorts, and covered neck to foot in tattoos, was Mick al-Basra, the Ming City Renegades' Thailand chief. Mick was also from the western suburbs of Melbourne, and he and Kilburn shared mutual friends and a girlfriend or two. Kilburn watched the gang leader walk up to the front door of the tattoo shop and unlock it with a key he had in his back pocket. As he did this, his Thai girlfriend, the young woman Kilburn had tracked, got out of the passenger side of the four-wheel drive and made her way toward the shop. After opening the front door and letting his lady enter the shop, Mick made his way back to his ute. When he stepped onto the road, he noticed that someone was blocking his path. The MCR chief stopped in his tracks and straightened up. He grinned, exposing his fake, extra white, extra large teeth. Meanwhile, Kilburn reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold chain he snatched off the neck of an MCR member the day before. He tossed it at Mick, who was still smiling when he caught the necklace. The MCR boss inspected the jewellery. He looked up. "Killer, the man himself. Me and you need to have a chat." The gang leader motioned for Kilburn to follow him. He turned around and headed into the tattoo shop. Kilburn followed on. As he entered the air-conditioned shop, Kilburn shivered. The change in temperature was stark. As he was closing the door behind him, Mick rolled a tattooist stool toward him. Kilburn stopped the stool with his foot and kicked it back toward the MCR chieftain. "I'll stand, thanks. This shouldn't take too long," Kilburn stated. "Fair enough," Mick replied nonchalantly as he crossed his arms. "What can I do for you then?" "I'm looking for someone." "Who's that?" "A courier." Mick Albazra was no longer curious regarding Kilburn's actions in Phuket and Pattaya, and his laid-back mood changed dramatically to one of alarm and dread. Kilburn recognised this and decided to use it to his advantage. "I'm not interested in you, your organisation, and whatever illegal activities you're into. No interest whatsoever. I just want the courier, and you know who I'm talking about. You know who I want? Just the courier, that's it." The grave expression on the bikie's face let Kilburn know he was on the right track. But before he could continue, Mick said, "I'm no fucking dog, mate." From experience, Kilburn knew that criminal codes, such as not informing on mates, fellow members, or criminal partners, was a nonsense. From the very top of the criminal food chain to the very bottom, when most criminals are under great threat, they'll talk or throw someone under an oncoming train. This train happened to be some powerful nation states and their security forces. Kilburn thought Mick Albazra needed reminding of this. Do you really want the full force of the Western world coming down on you? Do you understand what this is? What you're involved in? Think about it. "Oh, look, mate, it's just business for us. We've got nothing to do with any sort of terrorist shit. We're not monsters," declared the gang boss. "Well, when you're dealing with those types, it's not just business," Kilburn countered. "This is a major global security concern you're tied up in. You're fucked, mate." The MCR chief lowered his head and focused on the floor. As he mulled over and weighed up his next move or two, Mick's girlfriend walked out of the back office door behind him. She told him she was going out shopping and asked if he needed anything. He didn't move. He just uttered, "Nah, I'm right." As Kilburn watched the Thai woman walk by him and exit the shop, he remarked, "You going to give all this up for those cunts? You're fucking crazy." As the bikie thought some more, Kilburn decided to push him into a psychological corner, where survival of the self was the only option out. "That seaside property you have over the border in Cambodia? Your sanctuary in Koh Kong, where you get away from it all with your missus? Where you get away from all the drama and stress of being a bikie big shot? And all those plans you have to develop the place and retire there? They can disappear with a single drone strike." The MCR chief lifted his head and looked at his fellow Melburnian in horror. As far as Kilburn knew, he had no authority whatsoever from any government or organisation to use any physical or coercive force against anyone, let alone a drone strike. He was bluffing big time. But what Kilburn did know was that a lot of men like Mick construct and hold up a showy public false facade that hides their true self, and to maintain this public performance is a mentally exhausting endeavour. So exhausting that the facade maker must take frequent refuge and respite from such an effort. So, when Kilburn heard about Mick's property in Cambodia from Sarah, he knew it was a thumbscrew he could tighten to apply pressure on the bikie. And he was right. Mick Al-Bazra was distraught. "Okay, what do you want me to do?" "All I need is a time and place to locate him. Nothing more," Kilburn stated. Brad Kilburn was having a drink at the same table at the Bandicoot later that night. As he soaked in the vibrancy of the entertainment district, he wondered what business MCR, Kevin Khalil, and possibly Islamic State were conducting. How were these global groups with divergent purposes and goals connected? Kilburn knew that outlaw motorcycle gangs had taken advantage of lower barriers between nation-states and moved to Southeast Asia, especially countries that are close or contain parts of the notorious region, the Golden Triangle. This was so they can gain greater access and control of drug production and distribution. In a place like Thailand, OMCGs can also access tourist traps. There, they can immerse themselves economically and socially. Bikies buy businesses to use for the laundering of dirty money and marry Thai women and recruit locals to build social networks. Kilburn was deep in thought when the bar manager Penn approached his table and sat down next to him. They conversed and enjoyed each other's company for a few moments before Penn was called away, to her annoyance. While watching Penn walk away, Kilburn recalled that a terror group's interactions with organised crime is often parasitical. They use organised crime to access illegal skills, goods and channels to further their social and political goals. So what are Kevin Khalil's and his mates' goals here in Thailand? Kilburn quizzed himself. This was a mystery he was keen to unravel, even though it wasn't his goal. Kilburn picked up his beer on the table in front of him and took a sip. As he did, Penn sat back down next to him, and they picked up their conversation from where it had left off a few minutes ago. A beer or two later, a phone call to Penn interrupted their good time. She pulled her phone out of the back pocket of her jeans, but didn't recognise the number on its screen. She answered it anyway. When Penn heard the voice on the other end of the line, she became concerned and looked up the road to a busy sports bar. The call ended without her saying a word. She opened a video just sent to her phone. As Kilburn watched on, she studied some black and white film. When she'd finished watching the footage, Penn showed it to the man sitting next to her. The clip was from a CCTV camera outside the sports bar that was pointed in their direction. It was footage of Kilburn and Penn hanging out having fun. "Someone's sending me a message," Kilburn observed. Quote from Robert Greene. "Then suddenly a young Napoleon crosses our path, a person who does not respect tradition, who fights in a new way." Back in sticky, busy Bangkok, Kilburn was drinking another beer at the very back of another expat bar, situated halfway down a laneway. From where he sat, amongst other drinkers and in limited light, Kilburn could observe a well-lit walkway running away from his position and located in between two blowjob bars directly opposite. Lining the walkway were padlocked steel lockers used by street vendors and others to store goods and gear. He was halfway through his first beer when Kilburn spotted someone enter the walk space from its far end. Unfortunately, it was not who he was waiting for. Instead, a middle-aged local man moved toward a locker and opened it. The local pulled a half-filled garbage bag out of the locker, relocked it and left the walkway. Kilburn looked at his watch and rechecked the walk space. As two blokes left the bar, Kilburn was mulling over alternate plans in case his target, Khalil's courier, didn't show. As he was doing this, an athletically built man with a neatly trimmed beard, dressed in Nike gear and a belt bag strapped across his upper body, stepped into the walkway at its furthest entry. He looked all business and just as out of place as he did in Pattaya. Kilburn pulled his ops phone out of a pocket in his shorts and sent a message on it. Halfway down the walk space, the Nike-clad bloke extracted a key from his belt bag and unlocked and opened the locker under a bright light. The same man then trifled through a black sports bag sitting on a shelf in the locker. Meanwhile, a Thai man on a motor scooter pulled up outside the expat bar. The Thai man and Kilburn made eye contact from a few metres away. The local turned his head and identified his latest surveillance target. Seemingly unaware of what was going on, the Nike-clad man threw the sports bag over his shoulder, locked the locker, and left the same way he came. The Thai man on the motor scooter took off down the laneway in pursuit of his prey, who after a couple of days doing business in Bangkok's Arab Quarter, jumped on a passenger plane north to Chiang Mai. On the next flight from Bangkok to Chiang Mai was Brad Kilburn. While sitting in a seat on an aisle, Kilburn turned on his phone and opened the Khalil file. After gaining a degree in civil engineering, Kevin Khalil went in search of a career in that area. Unfortunately, opportunities in civil engineering were scarce and he couldn't afford further study. So Khalil ended up a low-skilled, casual labour post-study. Disillusioned, despondent, and still dealing with his past, Khalil partied and did a lot of drugs in clubs and at music festivals. Taking drugs quickly evolved into dealing drugs. Dealing drugs put him in contact with organised crime gangs, such as the Ming City Renegades. With Ming City, Khalil found an outlet for his issues once again. He also found status, direction, fun, and fraternity. However, bikie life was a superficial one. So after a couple of years with MCR, Kevin Khalil gave up his rank and negotiated his way out of the club. Once clear of Ming City, he went seeking what he was desperate for. As the passenger plane made its descent into Chiang Mai, Kilburn shut down his phone. When the aircraft landed, he made his way to his hotel as quickly as possible and checked in. He threw his bag into his room on the 7th floor and made his way down and out of the building. As he stood on a footpath outside his hotel, Kilburn looked back up at it. The Regal Hotel was one of the taller buildings in the city. Though like much of the area it inhabited, it had been hurt badly by the pandemic. This showed through the rust stains running down the hotel's once gold but now brown sign, fixed to the very top of the building. The weeping sign reminded Kilburn of a drunk, crying, heartbroken woman with mascara running down her heavily made-up face. Kilburn turned away from the sad sight and walked across Changklang Road, where locals were setting up their roadside stalls, from which they sold souvenirs and all sorts to tourists. Once over Changklang Road, Kilburn headed toward an entertainment area a couple of 100 metres away. When he got to the bar area, it was quiet. There were as many patrons as there were staff working in the small, side-by-side drinking holes. The number 1 bar, that looked out over the main road, was Kilburn's choice for a drink. He walked into the 10 by 5 metre bar and sat down where he could see up and down the road and who walked in and out of the area. He ordered a beer from a gorgeous woman with long black hair that ran down her back to her waist. She wore a tight blue dress that highlighted her curves and matched the contact lenses in her eyes. When she returned with his drink and placed it on the table in front of him, Kilburn complimented her on her hair. In reply, she stepped forward and placed her female honeypot up against his knee and said, "There's no hair down there." Both grinned, and Kilburn looked into her artificial blue eyes. He saw no life in them and wondered if he wasn't flirting with a robotic femme fatale from the future. She laughed at his confusion and asked if there was anything else he wanted. "Not yet, but we'll see how I feel later," Kilburn stated, still smiling. The Thai woman gave his thigh a light slap. Kilburn took a deep breath and tried to regather his thoughts. As he did, a bald, pale, slight male foreigner with old-school tattoos on his arms strolled into the bar. When he heard the same man's North American accent, he asked the Thai woman still stuck to his leg who he was. "He's one of the owners." "Oh, right." "Do you know him?" the Thai woman asked. "No," Kilburn replied. Though what he did know was that the Canadian was an associate of the Ming City Renegades. That's why Kilburn went for a beer there, to let all and sundry know he was in town and to stir things up, which is what he understood to be his real mission anyway. After saying hello to staff and regular drinkers, the Canadian spotted Kilburn and loathed him instantly. For the next hour or so, as the Australian drank and became more amorous with the blue-eyed Thai, the Canadian's anger snowballed. The number one bar was his kingdom, and the women in it and their bodies were owned by him, so he believed, and the stranger's presence questioned this fantasy and was the source of his fury. Kilburn had encountered the Canadian's type many a time in Southeast Asia and understood exactly what was going on in the slight man's mind and was amused by it. The Australian decided to ratchet up the Canadian's rage by asking the blue-eyed Thai to accompany him to another bar, to which she agreed. After finishing their drinks, the blue-eyed Thai and Kilburn walked out of the venue holding hands. As they did, two rough-headed men in elaborately decorated leather vests walked past them. Sewn on the back of their vests were Ming City Renegades patches. The two men turned and watched the Thai woman and Kilburn stroll off into the night. The bar they were heading for sat on a narrow road and opposite a tourist night market. A hip-high brick wall separated the drinking hole from the street, and behind it were some wooden stools. 4 local women were playing pool in the back corner, and the football was live on the large TV behind them. As they entered the venue, the blue-eyed Thai and Kilburn ordered a couple of drinks, then sat down on a wooden stool each. Both noticed the street and market was still. It was a little too quiet for Kilburn, so he asked the woman behind the bar to play some tunes. One beer down, Kilburn noticed what appeared to be a black utility with no lights on drive down the dimly lit street toward them. As he got closer, Kilburn observed someone standing up in the tray of the vehicle. When the utility got nearer, the driver, the man in the passenger seat, and the male in the tray pulled down brightly coloured clown masks over their faces. The vehicle was now close enough for Kilburn to see that the man in the tray had a handgun. Kilburn turned to the others in the bar and yelled, "Get down!" They froze. Meanwhile, Kilburn pushed the blue-eyed Thai under the wooden bench and behind the brick wall they sat at. By the time they took cover, 9mm rounds were thumping into the brick wall. The rounds striking brick sounded like someone hitting it with a sledgehammer in quick succession. When the gunfire ceased, Kilburn jumped up with legs of a wooden stool in each hand, and from a few metres proceeded to throw it at the man in the back of the utility. The masked man was looking down, changing magazines in his pistol, and didn't see the stool flying his way, so when it struck him with force, the gunman fell backwards and hit his head on the side of the tray and was knocked out. His pistol fell from his hand and bounced around inside the tray. Shocked by the counter-attack, the driver of the utility put his foot down on the vehicle's accelerator and took off at great speed. Kilburn looked around to see if anybody was injured. Luckily, no one was. They were just in a state of disbelief. When uniformed members of the Royal Thai Police arrived, they had regained their composure and gave the police officer an account of what had transpired. The blue-eyed Thai and Kilburn did the same, though the Australian did not let them know of his mission and suspicions. As he walked back to his hotel with his Thai companion, Kilburn rang Keith Higginson. Higo told Kilburn to stay in his hotel until instructed otherwise. Kilburn reached the Regal Hotel, entered the lobby, took the lift to the 7th floor, entered his room and flopped on the bed, exhausted. The blue-eyed Thai laid down next to him. After a night of deep sleep, Kilburn woke up refreshed and had a need to continue his journey into Kevin Khalil's life and mind, so rolled over and grabbed the ops phone sitting on the bedside table. Along with a greater self and family, what Kevin Khalil was desperate for was a greater understanding of the world. He was empty. To cure this curse, he read books and websites on Buddhism and Hinduism. He learned a lot, but these faiths just didn't stick. He then attended Christian services in great bluestone churches. There, under a giant Jesus nailed to a cross, he spoke with priests and parishioners. He found their devotion to God and community uplifting and something to pursue, but it just didn't fit in. Then one day, as he was about to enter his local bakery, he ran into a friend from school. This bloke was a practicing Muslim, and after a lengthy conversation, invited Khalil to join Islam. Khalil agreed on the spot. Kilburn closed the file on his phone. He knew what Khalil's next step was on the road to extremism, though greater detail on this scenario could wait till later. Kilburn had more pressing issues to deal with. He sent a message to Higginson. The reply from Higo was as before: "Stay in your hotel." After reading the message and placing his phone back on the bedside table, Kilburn looked at the blue-eyed Thai asleep under the sheets next to him. He lifted the sheets and checked out her curvaceous naked body. Right then he knew how he was going to spend the rest of his day. Toward the end of that day, Kilburn was restless and pacing up and down in his room. Concerned, the blue-eyed Thai watched on while sitting cross-legged on the bed. "Fuck it, let's go out. I'm not sitting around here. I've got to do something," Kilburn announced. "Let's go," the Thai replied. They showered together, got changed into some fresh clothes, and headed on foot toward the number 1 bar. When they got to the drinking hole, the Canadian was standing behind the bar with his arms crossed. When he spotted the Australian and the blue-eyed Thai walk into the venue, he unfolded his arms and stood in shock as the two sat down in the same place they met. Kilburn spun round on his stool and yelled at the Canadian, "I'll have a beer, and my companion here will have a vodka and Red Bull, thanks." Kilburn spun back round on his seat and continued his conversation with the Thai woman. 30 minutes later, 2 Royal Thai police vehicles pulled up and parked outside the bar. 4 uniformed police officers got out of each vehicle before going venue to venue, checking each bar's licence and the identity cards of staff members. In a venue at the back of the entertainment zone, police found 3 undocumented workers from Burma. 2 policemen escorted them out of the area and put them into the back of one of the police vehicles. Kilburn couldn't believe his luck. He knew the Canadian and Ming City Renegades members would believe he was behind the raid. This was confirmed by the dirty look the North American gave Kilburn as he ordered 2 more drinks. As those drinks arrived, the raiding Royal Thai police officers jumped in their vehicles and drove off up the road. Once he'd finished his beer, Kilburn was satisfied with his efforts. He'd showed his enemies he wasn't rattled and shit scared, and thanks to some luck, showed them he could wield and strike with weapons of the state. Kilburn stood up and walked out of the bar hand in hand with the blue-eyed Thai. As they strolled over a nearby bridge, Kilburn wondered what was next. 07:30 the next morning, Keith Higginson sent Kilburn a lengthy message, which Kilburn read on his phone while sitting on the edge of his bed in his room. Kilburn's presence in Chiang Mai and the subsequent reverberations had forced all sorts of nefarious types in Chiang Mai to take flight. Amongst them was Kevin Khalil's courier. He'd taken refuge in a compound just south of the border with Laos, along with 2 men who were wanted in Australia. After reading through the message carefully a couple of times, Kilburn felt it was safer for him to move around, so let his female Thai companion sleep peacefully while he went for a swim in the hotel swimming pool a few floors up. After his swim, he returned to his room. There, the blue-eyed Thai was awake, dressed, and on her way out the door. After the two said their goodbyes, Kilburn checked his phone again by the room's window and found instructions from Higo. He was told to be ready by 2000. At that time, an operative would pick him up at his hotel and drive him north, where he would marry up with members of a Royal Thai Army Special Forces team to observe, and observe only, the raid on the compound. So that's what's next, Kilburn said to himself. According to the message, the compound was owned and used by a drug lord to control his drug production and trafficking operations. At the end of the message, Higo wrote that he'd sent Kilburn a package. Right after finishing reading that sentence, there was a knock on the door. Kilburn opened it cautiously. Standing there in the hotel's blue uniform was a small, smiling local man with a large white envelope in his hands. Kilburn thanked the man, then took possession of the package. After closing the door, Kilburn tore open the parcel. In it was a Vietnam War-era South Vietnamese Army Special Forces tiger stripe camouflage long-sleeve shirt with paratrooper front pockets. Sewn in above the right side breast pocket of the shirt was a green and black patch with his surname embroidered on it. "This is fucking cool," Kilburn said out loud as he inspected the shirt in his hands. He placed the shirt on the bed and stared at it. Happy with his start to the day, Kilburn pulled his ops phone out of his shorts pocket and sat down at a table near the window and opened the Kevin Khalil file. Once accepting the call to Islam, Khalil dove deep into the belief system and read the Quran and attended his local mosque obsessively. In an Islamic State propaganda video, where Khalil is dressed in black and has an AK-47 in his hands, he explains that it was in this period that he was most content. He found explanations for the world and where he stood within it. He also found unity with those that followed the way of Muhammad. Though seeing fellow Muslims suffer injustice in foreign lands disturbed him immensely. He then states in the clip, "So one day I thought to myself, there must be more to Islam than just study and prayer." Just before 2000, Kilburn was in his room with his black work boots and pants on. He put on and buttoned up the tiger striped camo shirt and threw his backpack on before heading downstairs. In the large, high-roofed, deathly quiet lobby, a local man greeted him and showed him to a Toyota four-wheel drive that was parked in the hotel's covered car park. After throwing his backpack into the back seat, Kilburn jumped into Toyota's passenger seat. A radio that resembled a 1980s mobile phone sat in the console beside him. The radio crackled and emitted messages in Thai at a rapid rate. Once settled in the driver's seat, the local operative drove the Toyota out of the car park and through Chiang Mai's northern suburbs. As the Toyota cruised along a road that snaked through the scrub-covered mountain range that stood between Chiang Mai and Chiang Rai, Kilburn continued his journey along Kevin Khalil's radicalisation path. Seeking more than study and prayer, Kevin Khalil joined a global Islamic organisation that advocated for the establishment of a global caliphate through education and activism. With zeal, he brought into the organisation's beliefs and goals, so much so he devoted all his energy to it. He lived, worked and educated others in the organisation's bookshop, one amongst a few on a street in the western suburbs. Then the militant Islamic State rose up and spread like an oil fire across conflict-ridden Syria and Iraq. For Khalil, fighting for the Islamic State was an unmissable opportunity to become a hero and a champion of his people. After reading this, Kilburn looked up from his phone and out the front window of the Toyota and over the black hills and into the night northern sky. Kilburn's gut feel was that Kevin Khalil was close. Once over the mountain range and through the city of Chiang Rai, the four-wheel drive travelled through undulating country. The area was a mix of flat fields and scrub-covered hills. The Toyota turned off a main road and down a narrow one. Traffic on the radio was intermittent. Almost an hour later, the vehicle turned right onto a dirt road. Minutes later, the driver stopped the vehicle and picked up the radio in the console and sent a verbal message on it. He was messaged back immediately. The driver placed the radio in his lap and drove on slowly. The Australian peered through every window of the vehicle to map his surrounds. Then two armed soldiers appeared up ahead on the right, beside the road in the Toyota's headlights. The vehicle stopped. Kilburn grabbed his backpack out of the back seat and jumped out of the vehicle, which took off as soon as he closed the passenger door. Kilburn was now in the dark in the middle of fuck all with a couple of unknown armed men. He asked himself, "What the fuck are you doing?" But before he could answer the question, the soldiers flipped down their night vision goggles mounted on their helmets and patrolled off into the bush, one behind the other. With his eyes now adjusted to the dark, and with the aid of the stars that lit up the surrounding area, Kilburn noticed a small hill, roughly 150 metres away, in the direction the soldiers were headed. Behind the feature, artificial light shot up high into the night sky. Kilburn smiled and followed on behind the operators. Metres on, sweat poured from Kilburn's brow. The humidity had quadrupled in the close country. The ground inclined slowly, then they reached the base of the hill. The Australian took a couple of deep breaths before climbing the feature. When he got to the top of the hill, Kilburn's calves were tight and about to explode, and his quads were on fire. He sucked in some more air and looked ahead. The two soldiers continued over the crest of the hill. Kilburn followed. As he did, he passed by another operator sitting in scrub, who provided cover while him and the other two climbed the feature. Just below the crest, a gap in foliage gave a great view of the flat ground below. On the flat ground, elevated above the fields a couple of 100 metres away, was a circular compound lit up by floodlights. 6 double-storied, white-walled large buildings with dark roofs sat around and inside the compound, 2 of which were luxurious homes. Amongst the buildings were satellite dishes and a radio tower. Running out of the compound on the right through the fields was a dirt road. Kilburn stopped and stared at the complex, the sight of which made the drive and walk well worth it. As he was thinking this, the two soldiers squatted down behind some camouflage netting that had been set up amongst some foliage to create a concealed observation post. Sitting inside the netting were 2 more operators. One of these men was observing the compound through large binoculars mounted on a tripod. Kilburn threw off his backpack and pulled out his set of binoculars. Through the glasses, he scoured the compound. There was no sign of life, though there were lights on inside the buildings. He squatted down next to one of the soldiers, who he believed was the team leader, and asked for an update. The soldier informed Kilburn that there had been a couple of vehicles come and go from the compound earlier in the day. The vehicles had brought visitors to the larger of the 2 homes at the very back of the compound. Khalil's courier and his wanted companions were lounging around the pool of the same house in the afternoon. "When's H hour?" Kilburn inquired. 0300, answered the soldier. Kilburn checked his watch. It was a little before midnight. He stood back up, picked up his backpack, and took a few steps away from the observation post, and sat down where he had a great view of the compound. He checked his watch again. There was plenty of time. He laid back and looked up into the clear night sky. Plenty and a variety of thoughts went through his head as he laid there. Some were operational based, others were personal and probing, though one thought stood out and popped up the most. What the fuck are you doing? Every time he asked himself this, he'd sit back up and stare at the compound. He did this hoping the sight of the drug lord's headquarters would validate his recent decisions and actions. Though the upside to all this thinking was time passing quickly. Before he knew it, it was almost H hour. Then the sound of inbound helicopters could be heard approaching from the other side of the compound. Kilburn sat back up, picked up his binoculars that were sitting next to him and surveyed the complex below. Frantic human movement could be seen through the large windows of the salubrious homes. The sound of choppers grew louder. Then through the back glass sliding door of one of the homes that was closest and facing away from Kilburn, he spotted Khalil's courier. He was wearing his usual garb as he slid open the back door with force. Right behind him were two muscular men dressed similarly. They sprinted out of the home, past the rectangular pool, through the manicured gardens, then slid down the grassy embankment and into the field. Once on their feet, the three men ran as fast as their legs could take them in the direction of the observation post. Kilburn lost sight of them in the dark fields, though he wasn't concerned. There was a tight special forces cordon around the compound that would track the runners' movements. "Run," Kilburn said out loud. "Run to your mate Khalil. Show us where he's at." While all this was going on, the two Thai Army helicopters with its doors open and soldiers hanging out of them descended and touched down in a paddock next to the dirt track. The soldiers jumped out of the choppers. They then strode up the track toward the compound, spaced out and staggered in a single file, either side of the road. Through his binoculars, Kilburn was searching for his quarry in the fields when a blue flash back in the compound appeared in his peripheral vision. He adjusted his focus in the direction of the blue flash that emanated from inside the closest home. It was closely followed by a booming explosion that destroyed it. The other buildings in the compound spectacularly blew up as well. In the darkness, thick clouds of smoke and debris formed and billowed out and up into the night sky. Seconds later, an explosion 10 times bigger followed. This explosion levelled the compound, and its shock wave washed over and through Kilburn and the soldiers in the observation post. They all sat in awe. The cloud from this explosion was as thick as the compound and spiraled straight up and disappeared into the black beyond. Kilburn was holed up in a cheap hotel on the outskirts of Chiang Rai hours after the compound explosion. He was staring out of his hotel window at a car park and lush green farmland, wondering again what the fuck he was doing when he received a message from Higginson. In the message, Higo explained that Khalil's courier and his two wanted companions were holed up as well, but with a mid-level drug trafficker close to the border. It was believed they will attempt to cross the border over the Mekong River and into the golden city of Vice that night. After the message, there was a question from Higginson. "Do you want to observe?" "Absolutely," Kilburn typed in reply. Higginson immediately messaged back. "My man will pick you up tonight. More details to follow." With some time to kill, Kilburn opened the Kevin Khalil file in the phone in his hand. Once inside the borders of Islamic State, Kevin Khalil was trucked into a training camp. Once trained and armed, he was sent east, where he fought no-quarter battles in an English-speaking battalion against Shia militias. In these battles, in urban areas and dug-in positions in open country, he not only survived but thrived. To witness many of his comrades killed while he remained unscathed reinforced and inflated his self-importance. In his head, he was protected by God and destined for great things. Multiple promotions in quick succession also added to this belief. As the Islamic State crumbled due to coalition forces' pressure, the battalion led by Khalil fought and won a series of skirmishes as it retreated to Raqqa. This, while other units were being obliterated. His victories rode on the back of adaptation, attacking and counter-attacking with mobility and in many forms, using old and new weapons and technology, psychological and ideological motivation and demoralisation, building and breaking alliances and agreements, exploiting and destroying anyone or anything for his beloved Islamic State. Then it was reported that he was killed in a drone strike, though rumours suggest otherwise. The same operative in the same Toyota four-wheel drive picked Kilburn up at his hotel in Chiang Rai late in the afternoon. They drove north through the same country. Traffic on the same radio sitting in the console of the Toyota came in short bursts. Kilburn was relaxed and not a lot was going through his mind when the Mekong River appeared on the right, paralleling the road they were driving along. The sun had set, so the river was a glorious royal blue. The mountains behind the waterway were midnight blue, while the sky above was filled with swirling white and royal blue clouds, though it was night by the time the four-wheel drive reached its destination. This was a poorly maintained, four-storey building sectioned into shop houses and stretched out along the riverbank for 100 metres. Headlights on, the Toyota pulled up and parked at the far end of the structure. Just as the vehicle came to a halt, a local man in black trousers and green shirt stepped out of the vacant shop on the end of the building. The same man approached Kilburn as he got out of the four-wheel drive and threw his backpack on. As the Toyota took off slowly, the Thai man put out his hand. "Kilburn, right?" "That's me." The two shook hands. "I'm Win." "Pleased to meet you, Win. Higo asked me to look after you." "Cool. What are we doing?" The Thai turned and walked toward the building. Kilburn followed. Inside the shop was a set of stairs. Both men climbed the stairs to the rooftop in darkness. When they got to the uncovered rooftop, gold light emanating out of the King's Roman Casino and Hotel illuminated the opposite bank of the river. "It's monstrous," Kilburn observed by the balustrade at the front of the building. "Last time I was up this way, all you could see from here was the gold crown on top of the casino that was amongst some trees. Now this!" Wynne smiled. "The Golden City crystal meth belt," Kilburn quipped as he soaked in the scene. A few seconds passed before Wynne received a phone call. When he finished the call, Wynne let Kilburn know that the three that escaped the compound raid were on their way to their position. "How long?" Kilburn inquired. "About 20 minutes. While waiting, Kilburn and Wynne discussed drug and sex trafficking, money laundering, scams and slavery, and other activities that take place in the special economic zone over the river. Then the Thai received a message on his phone. After reading the message, Wynne informed Kilburn that the vehicle ferrying the wanted men was close. The local man turned and walked off to his left. He stopped and stood where he was still in darkness, but could observe the path and stairs that ran from the road down to the river. Kilburn did the same, then looked out over the next building. It had a giant white cross on its roof that was facing the river and was partially lit by the Golden City. The sign under the cross, that was large enough to be seen from the opposite bank, read, "God loves you." The cross and sign amused Kilburn, though he lost his grin when a blacked-out Mercedes-Benz wagon pulled up at the top of the path. Out of the Mercedes jumped the same three men that had fled the drug lord's compound the night before. Nervy and in a hurry, the three stepped it out down the path and stairs and onto a shaky wooden jetty on the river. There waiting for them was a wooden boat only a few metres long. The vessel's skipper was standing in the stern with his hand on the throttle of the idling outboard motor, bolted onto the back of the boat. In darkness, the three fugitives stepped down off the jetty and into the craft. Once the three men were seated on wooden benches in the boat, the vessel took off at speed. They sat not saying a word, as the boat made a beeline for the golden city of Vice on the other side of the waterway. As he watched the craft cross the river, Kilburn was 100% sure where his quarry was holed up. A semi-autonomous, organised crime-governed area located in the heart of the Golden Triangle was a perfect place for Kevin Khalil to run his operations out of, whatever that entailed. Quote from Robert Greene: "Wage guerrilla war on your mind, allowing no static lines of defence, no exposed citadels, make everything fluid and mobile." Now that Kevin Khalil had been located, captured, and thrown into a deep dark well of unimaginable horrors, Brad Kilburn was back in Bangkok for a meeting with Keith Higginson. When Kilburn walked into a sports bar on Sukhumvit Road, there was a raucous crowd inside. Sitting at a table in a back corner of the poorly lit bar was Higo. After making his way through the crowd, Kilburn approached and greeted Higginson with a nod. "Grab a seat. We have a lot to discuss," stated the older man. "We do," Kilburn replied, as he pulled up a chair and sat down opposite Higo. "I took the liberty of ordering for you. The lamb roast here is the best in Bangkok," Higginson explained. "Sounds good. A couple of beers would be nice to go with it," Kilburn suggested. Higo smiled and called a waitress over and ordered them both a couple of beers. As the older man did this, Kilburn noticed a couple of tattooed men in tight t-shirts and mohawk haircuts, sitting with some surgically enhanced Thai women in tight dresses. "Mates of yours?" Higginson joked. "Yeah," Kilburn said as he smiled and raised his eyebrows. "By your reports, it sounds like you made a few friends in the last week or so." "Friends, enemies, acquaintances, family, what's the difference?" Kilburn remarked. Higginson chuckled as the waitress arrived with their tankards of beer and placed them down in front of them. "That's what you brought me here for, wasn't it? To make a few friends and some enemies as well? Stir up a bit of shit? Create a bit of chaos?" Kilburn asked. Higginson laughed and added, "Well, chaos you certainly did create. A stabbing, shooting, and one almighty explosion that was felt right back here in Bangkok. Enough chaos to get the Thais to conduct a cross-border raid, right?" Kilburn inquired. The older man didn't answer the question. He picked up his ice-cold tankard and gulped down some beer. When he'd finished, Higo commented in a serious tone, "You're underestimating yourself and what you've achieved, Kilburn. No one else could have done what you did." Both men surveyed the crowd for a few moments before Higginson asked, "What do you reckon this unrestricted degradation warfare thing Khalil was talking about?" "I've been thinking about that since my run-in with him. I think he's referring to a book written by some Chinese military officers that looks to wage war against China's rivals, not just through traditional military ways, but through non-military ways. For instance, conducting political warfare, like exacerbating social divides through social media, co-opting politicians, bureaucrats and civil society. Then there's economic and technological disruption, or fanning social ills through drug production and trafficking. Something like that." "So that's what you reckon? The Khalil was looking to conduct a bit of unrestricted warfare in the Golden Triangle?" the older man inquired. "Don't know, maybe. I wouldn't put it past him. He thinks out of the box, that's for sure. Or maybe he was just looking to fundraise for Islamic State through all sorts of organised crime. Hezbollah do it. They're big in South America." Higginson frowned and commented, "This unrestricted warfare sounds like a load of rot to me. War is violent. One group waging war against another. Then there's war and then there's peace and nothing in between as far as I'm concerned. And the rest is just subversive operations. Nothing new. But anyway, is this what your guts is telling you? That he was up to this unrestricted warfare business?" "Yeah. That he had a long-term, unlimited fluid strategy, hence unrestricted degradation warfare." You got to understand, he's a destroyer. He hates himself and he hates the world, and he wants to destroy it any way possible. Blokes like him were born to destroy and die, Kilburn declared. Ah, well, all his plans are null and void now, Higginson observed. We'll see, Kilburn replied. Just as he finished his sentence, Kilburn's lamb roast arrived. Higginson's meal followed. Both men tucked into their food without speaking. The only time they stopped eating was to drink beer. Both finished their meals quickly. As Kilburn pushed his empty plate away from him, he said, "Well, thanks for the opportunity. If you have any more work, let me know. I'll be doing fuck all back in Melbourne, so I'll be available. Don't worry, I'll be in touch." Kilburn sculled down the rest of his beer and stood up. "That's me done. Thanks again, Higo. I'll catch you later." Keith Higginson stood up and they shook hands. Kilburn turned and left the bar and headed toward another in a laneway nearby. When he got to this drinking hole that he drank at every time he was in Bangkok, Kilburn took a seat at the bar. Behind the bar was a gorgeous 20-something woman with an even more gorgeous smile. He ordered a vodka lime and soda and decided to settle in for the night. As he knocked back drink after drink, the bar filled up with more people out for a good time. Some played pool, some danced, some sat and drank quietly like Kilburn, who was getting along well with the woman behind the bar, when he lost consciousness. When he woke, Kilburn was nauseous and lying on his back and looking up into the night sky and bathed in artificial light. He rolled his head to the right and looked into the headlights of a white Nissan Ute parked metres away. He rolled his head to the left, where he could hear men conversing. 20-odd metres away, two locals in t-shirts and shorts were digging a hole by a creek line with the aid of the vehicle's headlights. Standing with them overseeing the dig was Draymond, the Ming City Renegades member. Kilburn lifted his head and noticed he'd been zip-tied at the wrists. Dizziness got the better of him and his head fell back onto the grass. He didn't panic or start to cry. Instead, he took a couple of deep breaths. When his head had cleared a little, he lifted it and got up into a sitting position. The effort made his head spin so much he felt like he was going to vomit. Kilburn took more deep breaths. Then a clear, instinctive thought struck him. Someone was behind him. He looked up and around as far as he could. Standing there looking over him with a big grin on his face was Ming City renegade chieftain Mick al-Basra. Kilburn turned his head back around and stared into the dark. "Hurry up and get your head together," Mick said. Seconds passed before the bikie asked, "Are you feeling better or what?" "Yeah, enough to stand," Kilburn lied. Mick al-Basra picked Kilburn up from under the armpits and onto his feet. Kilburn's head spun so much that if it hadn't been for Mick propping him up, he would have fell. "You right there, killer?" the bikie boss inquired. Kilburn didn't answer. He just tried as hard as he could to gather himself physically and cognitively. As he was doing this, Draymond yelled out from the edge of the fresh hole, "Give us a few more minutes. It's not deep enough yet." "Take your time," Mick replied, as he cautiously released Kilburn from his grip. Now steadier on his feet, Kilburn turned around and stared at al-Basra, as if to ask what was going on. Rising and fighting through the nausea were Kilburn's instincts. They were telling him there was more to this situation than his execution. "You right? You ready to go?" Mick asked. "Yeah, I'm ready to go," Kilburn lied again. The gang leader chuckled before replying, "You don't look right, mate." Mick al-Basra looked around to where the others were situated. Draymond was walking off in the other direction toward the creek line. "This is our chance," the bikie boss observed. Hurriedly, Mick pulled Kilburn's folding knife out of a back pocket of his shorts and unfolded it. He then stepped forward and cut off the zip ties around Kilburn's wrists. With his free hand, al-Basra pulled a large, black, long-barrelled revolver from out of the back of his shorts and handed it to Kilburn, grip first. With adrenaline shooting through his body, Kilburn grabbed the revolver, looked Mick in the eyes and marched off toward the waterway. The two men digging the hole froze when they spotted Kilburn coming their way. They said nothing when he passed them. When he reached the top of the creek bank, Kilburn stopped. In the creek line in the dark, Draymond was facing the creek urinating. The bikie turned slowly. With the revolver in both hands, Kilburn aimed at the centre of the big bloke's torso and squeezed the trigger twice. The rapport of the large calibre revolver shattered the quiet night. Struck twice, Draymond fell back into the long grass and convulsed a few times before taking one last big audible breath. He then stayed still. Kilburn walked down into the creek line and into the long grass and stood by the prone man's head. The fresh breeze flowing along the creek and the sight of another dead adversary restored Kilburn's physical and psychological well-being. With just enough light to do what he wanted to do, Kilburn raised the revolver in both hands and fired 2 rounds into Draymond's skull. Blood and brain matter went flying and plastered Kilburn and the long grass encircling the dead man. Kilburn was a bloody mess when he walked up the creek bank, past the ties and toward Mick al-Basra, who by now was holding a pistol in his right hand. "We all good?" the gang boss asked nervously. Kilburn stopped and stood and stared at Mick. The bikie chief wasn't sure what was going to happen next, so blurted out, "Draymond was responsible for that fight in Pattaya, not me. I didn't order that, mate. He was responsible for what happened in Chiang Mai. I told him to pull his head in, but he wouldn't listen. He was out of control. He was obsessed with that Thai chick in Phuket, you both know. So he had to go, mate. He had to go." Al-Basra's shaky disposition flicked a switch in Kilburn. "Let's get the fuck out of here," Kilburn calmly ordered as he walked toward the Nissan Ute. On his way to the vehicle, Kilburn wiped his face with the front of his t-shirt he was wearing, while the revolver remained in his right hand. When he got to the vehicle, he jumped into the passenger seat. The bikie boss got into the driver's seat. He started the ute and drove through the field toward a road and turned onto it. As they drove through the countryside, the Ming City chief asked Kilburn, "What's next, mate? Sticking around Thailand?" Kilburn smiled. "Nah, mate. Lucky for you, I'm heading back to Oz." "Cool," a relieved al-Basra replied before adding, "I guess you got your man, Khalil, and that's it then. Done." Kilburn gripped the pistol in his hand tighter and turned and said to Mick, "This is nowhere near done. You won't catch me fighting the last war." The end. Never Fight the Last War was written and narrated by Green SK and recorded at Phantom Studios. All rights reserved.